Hello, and welcome to Exolore, a show about facts-based fictional world building. I'm your host, Moiya McTier, and I have something a little special planned for this episode. The recent Black Lives Matter protests, sparked by the unjust murders of Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, and Ahmaud Arbery, have struck a chord with me. They've brought to the surface an ever-present sense of grief and anger that I know many other members of the Black community feel as well. I wanted to turn my pain into something productive for my community, so I've invited a geologist, a historian, and a literature and media expert to help me imagine life on a world without a history of slavery and colonization. To my Black listeners, I love you and I feel your pain. I hope this episode provides a sense of relief, even if it's just temporary. And to my non-Black listeners, I urge you to engage deeply with this episode and continuously work towards building a reality here on Earth more like the one we're about to discuss. Now let's get started. The first thing we're going to do is introduce ourselves so that we can all get to know each other and the listeners can get to know us. And Nikita, you're at the top of my screen, so would you mind telling us who you are, what you do, and a fictional world that you're escaping to right now, whether that's a TV show or a book or a game or whatever?
Okay, my name is Nikita Cruz. I am an economic geologist. I just finished up my PhD at University of Michigan last September. I study ore deposits, and the reason why I study ore deposits is because they're the source of the metals and non-metals that are so important to the way we as humans live today. And I particularly use the chemistry of minerals to understand ore deposits. I am talking to you guys today from Georgetown, Guyana, which is home for me. And so for the last 6 months, I've been working at the local geologic survey here in Guyana, trying to learn the geology of Guyana and to think about how we can use this geological knowledge to find new ore deposits here in Guyana that we can then use to generate revenue for development.
That's so cool.
Fictional world that I've been escaping to. I don't know, it has been the last few months dealing with the pandemic and all this stuff has been really stressful. Mm-hmm. So my escape has been just like watching TV, just watching random shows on Netflix. And so the thing I've been watching a lot of recent is Modern Family because I think it's hilarious and I like laughing. And I mean, laughing is definitely, I think, an important thing to be doing at this time. Yeah,
absolutely. Thank you. Jessica, what about you?
Jessica Ray Johnson. Hey, everybody. I'm an assistant professor of history at Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore. My work is I'm a historian by training, and so I do work on histories of slavery and diaspora. I focus mostly on 18th century and 19th century and slave trades and slavery that's happening between the U.S., the Caribbean, and West Africa. So my book, which is available for pre-order and should be out by the end of July, hopefully, for certain.
We'll definitely be linking to that pre-order link down below.
It's titled Wicked Flesh, Black Women, Intimacy, and Freedom in the Atlantic World. And it is the shortest version of the way I describe it is the Black feminist history of the founding of New Orleans. So it goes from Senegal to the Caribbean to New Orleans. And so that's a lot of my work. So it's also really heavy. So I do a lot of escaping, speaking of fantastic fictional worlds. Normally it's escaping into some Netflix, sci-fi, fantasy something, which Nikita, I vibe really hard with binging. But quarantine has been so long that I'm actually gotten tired of Netflix, which I didn't think ever happened. So I went back to pleasure reading, which has been really nice. So I picked back up N.K. Jemisin's 100,000 Kingdoms trilogy.
Yes.
It is exquisite and also devastating. And so that's sort of the world that I've been absconding to lately, the Kingdom of Sky and the Arameri and the Dar and the gods who are battling to, not be as human and flawed as they actually are. So yeah that's where I'm at.
Such a beautiful story. Susana, what about you?
Hey folks, I'm Susana Morris. I'm an associate professor of literature, media, and communication at the Georgia Institute of Technology, Georgia Tech, in Atlanta, Georgia. And I was trained as a, literature scholar, although I've sort of moved into Black media studies And for the last several years, I've identified as an afrofuturist. So I'm really interested in particularly how Black women envision the future, right?
Yes.
Particularly, thinking about resistance and things of that nature. And more recently, in the past maybe 2 years, I've been thinking more about climate change and climate science and how Black women, cultural producers, sort of think us through that and offer sort of alternative ways of knowing and alternative futures. So that's what I've been working on lately. Fictional worlds, Jemison always, right? I mean, she's just so good.
Yeah.
But lately I've been reading this, The Deep. It's a novella by River Solomon. They are a non-binary writer based out of the UK. Black non-binary writer, and this is a novella that is about Black mermaids.
Oh,
so it's sort of the story of like Drexciya, right? The kind of Afrofuturist digital music band, and then Clipping, which is Daveed Diggs, William Hudson, Jonathan Snipes. They sort of did a song that was an homage to Drexciya, and it's about Black women who were, on slave ships about to be enslaved and who were thrown overboard. They're pregnant, and so they pass away, and their progeny, they become mermaids, and they have this whole mermaid community, and they have to sort of remember their past. So this may not be the best thing to be reading in such a heavy moment. Real talk, it's like so gorgeous. The prose is so gorgeous, and like River Solomon, their first novel is called An Unkindness of Ghosts, and I just recommend it to everyone. Like everyone sends on their own, but I feel like they are the closest I've read to like being an heir of Octavia Butler. Where you read and you're devastated, but you're like, oh, but this was gorgeous. That kind of reading, you know what I mean? So it's like that. So it's only 150 pages, and I think I'm like 50 pages in, and it's just real hard. So I might need an escape from my escape because it's just so devastating, but also gorgeous.
Well, hopefully this exercise can be that escape from the escape for you. So my name's Moiya McTier. I'm an astrophysicist and a folklorist by training because I'm horrible at making decisions. And I study planets outside of our solar system, but I am also trained in fictional world building. So I combine them by doing this with you. Thank you so much for being here with me. And the fictional worlds that I've been escaping to lately, I've just been feeling really nostalgic and like in the mood to read about people uprising, like a group of oppressed people rising up and like overturning the system of oppression. And so I recently started reading again Tomi Adeyemi's Children of Blood and Bone and Tamora Pierce's Trickster's Choice. And both of them are just giving me such like, things are really hard right now, but like there is a way out of it feelings, and I'm really here for that. Yeah. Thank you for those books, for that book recommendation and those TV show recommendations. I will be adding them to my list. But speaking of fictional worlds, we're here to build our own. And this is a little bit different from my usual episodes because I usually try to make the worlds as different from Earth as possible. In this exercise, I really wanted to imagine what the world could have been like without slavery, without the transatlantic slave trade, without a history of European imperialism and colonization. And so I tried to think of a planet characteristic that would make that possible. And so today's planet is just a really big planet. It's about 1.5 times the size of the Earth, which gives it a surface area of 2.25 times the size of the Earth. So all of the land masses are bigger and they're much farther apart from each other than they are here on our planet. And when that happens, you can imagine a scenario where colonization and like traveling to another country to do horrible things to the people who already live there won't happen because the land masses are too far apart. So in this episode, we're going to imagine a world that's too big for colonization to really take root. Wakanda from the Black Panther franchise is a really good example of what could happen, or it's a common example that most people are familiar with of what could happen without European imperialism coming in and just like fucking shit up. but the thing about Wakanda is that it's a single, like, sovereign nation in Africa that, because of their strength and because of the geography around them, managed to escape colonialism. And I want to imagine what would the whole diaspora be like if the entire continent of Africa had been left alone, and if there hadn't been this repeated stripping of resources and wealth and people from the African continent. What would that be like today and throughout history? So that's what this exercise is going to be, and I hope that it's a hopeful one for a lot of people who are struggling right now. That's enough talking from me. Whenever I'm world building, I try to imagine the physical environment first. And so I have invited Nikita here because she is an expert in geology, so like rocks and the physical resources that you can have. So Nikita, do you know much, or what can you tell us about the natural resources that are available on the African continent?
All right, so I'm gonna start off by saying, so like the African continent here on Earth, as you guys know, is vast. It's like giant, right? And so I know we're on like a different planet, but if we're on a different planet that is much larger, so I would imagine that, you know, the African continent on that continent or on that new world would be much larger than it is today, or like the one here that we have on Earth. But I say all of that to say that, you know, the African continent is vast, and with that comes lots of interesting geology. And with that geology comes lots of interesting resources. So Africa is home to, it's very resource rich, right? Like everyone knows that. And so all of the things that, you know, are used today in our technologies and all that stuff can be sourced from Africa. They exist there. All the gold, diamonds, the silver, iron, copper, there's oil there, you know, all those important resources exist on the continent. So I think, you know, on this fictional world that we're building, if we have an Africa type continent, it would definitely have all these resources that we would need to be able to, you know, make the things that we need to make to live.
That's great, because I think
civilization started.
Yeah, I think so many people think of Africa as this resource poor, like resource depleted continent, if they even realize that it's a continent, because so many people don't, which is awful. But yeah, it's really great to hear from an expert that it does have all of the resources that you could need to build up a rich civilization. What about geographic diversity? I mean, if you look at Africa, it's absolutely massive. I think it covers about a fifth of the surface of the planet, and it spans from a latitude of like negative 35 degrees to 35 degrees north. It's absolutely huge. And so there's a lot of different weather patterns that you can get throughout the continent. But what about geography? It's not just a desert, right?
It definitely is not just a desert. You know, like you said, it covers a great expanse of latitude. And so with that comes different types of climatic conditions, as you so mentioned. So the desert, which is what a lot of people think about, I guess, when they think of Africa, is just the northernmost part of Africa. But as you go to further south into sub-Saharan Africa, right, there's that part of Africa that is around the equator. And so like on the other side in South America, which is where I am, you know, there's forest there. There's lush, very lush green forest. You know, and as you continue to go further south into the southern hemisphere, you can get changes, or there exist different types of like, you know, more temperate regions and
Amazing. Yeah, great. So let's keep that in mind. I mean, my guests don't have to keep that in mind. I'm sure we know how diverse Africa can be. But the listeners, in case you don't know, let's keep that in mind as we go forward in the discussion. Great. So usually this would be the point in the show where I start talking about biology, but I'd like to keep the life forms on our imaginary planet human, so that we can draw as many parallels to like actual history here on Earth as possible. So let's move on to culture. And a lot of this will actually just be discussing cultures that have existed here on Earth, in Africa. In Africa. Prepositions are hard. Um, but so now I'd like to start talking about what values and traits are respected, which can then become like, how do societies choose leaders? And Jessica, I'm wondering if you have maybe examples from historical like nations in Africa here on Earth's history.
Yeah, this is a great question. A great exercise in general. So in general, thank you for it. So we're 1.5 times larger. So we have more spread, even in already the vast continent that exists today. One thing I can think of is that one of the unique features of the African continent that goes along with its size and that correlates with like how cultures and polities are created and how they break and reform, essentially, the rise and fall of cultures and polities and nations, is that there had to sort of emerge this sense of like, private enclosure property. There just wasn't enough space until the introduction of different kinds of values over a slow reach of time to be so identified with a particular plot of land, like this is your land. Like the idea of private property in some ways had to develop. And developed in particular in relationship to slavery and the slave trade and the introduction of property and changing property relations and relations to property that beget. But what that means is that, the capital, the wealth, essentially, in polities and cultures isn't necessarily the land or kingdom that you own. It's the people who have pledged allegiance to you. And so that looks different in different ways. So leaders, some are patriarchal societies and very hierarchical. Some are patriarchal sort of in name, but have female figureheads that are of great importance. The wives, the queen mothers, the oldest sisters. You'll see that across various polities. You'll also see ways that what people call sometimes derogatory, but that's not how it should be said. That's not how I'm saying it. Stateless societies, itinerant societies, whether nomadic or simply less hierarchical and less in stasis. You also have a proliferation of that. So you have the range of polities that are moving in and out of other maybe more hierarchical polities that are claiming dominion over certain spaces, but can't really police the boundaries in the ways that we imagine that, like this is your wall. Those are in some ways more constructed in people's political imagination than they are real, because there's just too much space. There was too much space to take over and to really police those boundaries. So you have different kinds of, a whole range of leadership systems that might emerge from that. And so we can think of the world that we're building as one in which perhaps stateless is not a derogatory word, and in fact that's a principle of strength within societies, that being able to pick up and move your community, whether it's 50 people or 10,000, is actually a key feature and a desired feature, as opposed to what has sort of emerged in like our modern parlance, which is that you have a kingdom and that's stable and you're able to build up as opposed to build out.
Right. Also, being able to move that many people is impressive as hell. Like that takes a lot of skill and communication that is like vastly underrated.
It's phenomenal. And if you have, even more space than is already on the continent now, then that I can see something like that developing, where like the strength of a polity is its ability to really move across time and space and not to remain in place. That actually those are the weaker societies and those are the ones that are more vulnerable. You also have the impact that has on things that we think of as identity or race or ethnicity, that those things, one of the arguments that people in African diaspora history have are the ways that identity is actually potentially more fluid, and there's many contentious arguments about this because ethnicity is a hot topic among scholars. particularly as it relates to African polities. But there is an argument to be made that because of this kind of fluidity on this vast continent, people are making and remaking their identities in ways that are just foreign to a modern Western sensibility. So when people say that they are Congo-Angolan, or they're Babana, or they're Wolof, that may mean something in one time and place, and that actually may shift, and it still may be just as real. So this idea of like your genealogy or your biology being determinant of your ethnicity or your race, that actually may shift in some really interesting ways if we have this much space to move, and if the idea is to be able to move and to reintegrate and integrate yourself into other societies. So that could actually get complicated in some pretty exciting ways.
Yeah.
We hope.
Absolutely.
Yeah. All right. Free movement from place to place sounds great to me as a person from a country where you need a visa to go everywhere. So I'm all about it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Susana, do you have any thoughts? Also, like, feel free to jump in with your own questions and comments.
Wondering what exploration might look like outside of a context of colonization, right? So this is a huge planet and things are very far away, but human beings are curious.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm wondering what just traveling from place to place, outside of sort of understanding oneself as a part of a state or stateless, but like an individual who's like, I want to see what's beyond that river, right?
Mm-hmm.
And not with the intention of colonizing the people or taking the folks over on the other side, but like, what kind of fish do they have in that river? What kinds of languages do they speak over there? Like, human beings generally want to have those kinds of explorations. And if we could divorce that from, I have right and I have might and I want to go over the river and conquer these people and take what they have, but rather I want to develop, it could be trade. It could be like, I heard there were some fine people across the river. That's where the fine people are at. I saw them, I was on the mountain and I looked over and I was like, woo, who's that? I could go over and see what's up with them. They are very cute, right? That, I think that there could be a whole different understanding of folks moving from place to place and interacting with one another, right? That it doesn't have to be like, I have the most power and I'm just trying to dominate you. It could just be like, imagining the stateless solution where folks are just moving around. It's like, oh, those folks move every season and we know they're going to be next to us and we always trade with them and we always know the cuties are over there and they have this kind of science and we're just interacting. It could be a completely different thing. It almost makes me think of Butler in the Parable series, and she says, the destiny of Earthseed is to root among the stars, right? And they're trying to escape a terrible Earth. But what would it be like if there were African technologies that were interested in traveling or even going into space, but it was really just about learning rather than we need to go to the moon and mine for this in a way that was really negative, right? But that wasn't a way that, I wonder if we could just change our notion of exploring culturally.
Yeah, I absolutely love that. And that leads into thinking about what industries might rise up. Because I would definitely want to get to the point where we talk about specifically what types of alliances and interactions would happen between different groups of people. But let's first think about what types of technologies and knowledge they would have. Let's remember that the Library of Alexandria was in Egypt, which is in Africa. And if the Romans hadn't come in and the Romans burned down the library, right? That was them. I'm not a historian.
Neither am I.
I think you're safe. Yeah.
Okay, great. So if that hadn't happened, there would be this vast store of knowledge that would exist.
Plus Timbuktu.
Yeah. So if you have all of these things that don't get ripped away or destroyed, like what booming industries would we have on this continent?
I mean, that is sorry, go for it.
Go for it.
I mean, I'm definitely not a historian, right? But like when you think about, and this is probably taking us away from, the types of conversations that we want to have, right? But like when you think about wealth, right? There are all these stories about Mansa Musa, I hope I'm saying that name correctly, who had all this gold and was just walking around sharing that out, So like we know there's a ton of gold all over Africa. Well, like there's a lot of gold in West Africa. Like Ghana is like the world's largest producer of gold for the last couple of years,
Oh, wow.
right? So there's that. So maybe we would have had a budding gold industry that could have been used for trade, or that could have been used as, people travel from place to place, whether it's for checking out the different food that exists in a place, or because, that's where the cuties are. So let's go over there and so I think that is definitely a possibility.
Nice. And the just from a science perspective, gold is really good at withstanding temperature changes, so it's really commonly used in like scientific industry, like in technology. So if they have huge stores of gold, then they can also use that in their advanced technology once they get to that point.
Definitely.
I mean, I'd be really curious, and Nikita, you probably would know the answer to this in a world building sense, certainly better than I do. But I wonder about whether sort of advanced technologies, in the sense of like the things that we're talking on now, the minerals that require the things that we're talking on now, I wonder if that comes along faster and remains even more internal, like almost Wakanda-ish in the continent, in the kind, if you have that much vast space. And the reason I'm wondering that is, like the way I think about industry and its development is so contingent on slavery and the slave trade and colonialism, and contingent on, requiring bodies to be sort of moved across somewhere or moved somewhere and then confined in a kind of like enclosure model. And I wonder if that's not the case, do societies invest deeper in like more sustainable agriculture, sustainable, like not like industries that are so big that they're basically wealthy for only a certain segment of the population, but in a spread of and a diverse array of industries and agriculture and economies and employment, to the extent that employment is needed, that might better serve everybody. And I guess it sort of also goes along with the theme of like, if there is that much more space, then you sort of have to entice people to stay, because you can't, in the fantasy world, if I don't go Butterish, you can't, let's assume that you can't really force people to stay outside of an astronomical level of violence that doesn't make sense in a 1.5 times larger space. You can entice them to stay, though, with societies that, have enough for everybody. So does that look like not investing in certain kinds of mining, but maybe, that mining becomes something that, I don't know, maybe a guild of like techno scientists, Africana techno scientists gets created over time, that instead of that mining going out elsewhere, that mining being exploitative to those who are mining, that becomes a community that then has a different kind of knowledge. I don't know. This is all spitballing completely.
No, it's not.
I mean, I was going to say, I think in thinking about industries and technologies and how those get developed, I mean, this is definitely not my worldview, right? But I think about peoples who are living on the land and look around at the resources that exist and think about, how best can we use these resources to impact and influence our lives and to help us to do the things that we want to do. And so what I will say is that all the resources exist, and it would be a matter of the people on the continent to figure out, all right, what can we use this to do? And I would bet that the people on the continent would figure out how to use those resources and get their things done, whether it be sustainable, agriculture and, developing technologies that would help them live in the spaces where they are. Yeah, for sure. I definitely believe that would happen.
I think to that end, like just having more expansive ideas of like what living well is, right? I think like sort of what both of y'all are saying, that maybe it would be a universal basic income. Like maybe it's like there's just no one's homeless, like everyone has shelter, or like no one is hungry, like just resource rich, right? And this different idea of then like, well, me and my individual family I take care of this, and maybe more of a communal, but not in that sort of stereotypically communal sense, but just like if you live in Wakanda or whatever it is, everybody eats.
Yeah.
Regardless of your job, you're an engineer, doesn't matter. Or you come in from the outside, you're from that neighboring place from across the river, you eat too, rather than this exclusionary sort of, we start with serfdom and then we go to chattel slavery kind of mentality, right? Because not that we want to talk so much about Europe, but I think part of the issue is that they strip themselves of their own indigenous cultures for this blanket whiteness and then try to export that whiteness everywhere, right? Rather than staying at home and working on their own stuff. So if we could stay at home and work on our own stuff, right? I think that's what this exercise is kind of inviting us to do. Right. They were like, we don't have spices. Let's go somewhere else and take theirs and they're not using our food. That's a problem. Rather than us sort of saying, let's focus on our own spices, let's focus on
let's figure out what spices can be cultivated here instead of taking someone else's spices.
Someone else's stuff.
I both love and hate the idea that so much of the horrible stuff that's been done in the world is because people just wanted tastier food.
It's so
and then did make their food tastier.
Have you?
Their food is bad. It's a problem.
They had the nerve to go around the world taking over different places to steal spices and then didn't even use them.
No,
the gall.
It's really, really true. And some of our favorite addictive things are from literally from this era: sugar, tobacco, coffee, chocolate, which is also sugar and coffee. But this is that moment. But that also, almost to kind of build on this industry piece or the history and economies piece, and to go along with what you were saying, Susana, about the exploration piece. I mean, let's assume, I don't know, so let's say part of the story is the Portuguese still, try and travel their way south, right? And they still try, they maybe don't land in the, Cape Verde Peninsula and Senegambia until, 1460 instead of 1441, whatever it might be. Takes them a little bit longer.
They would need more time to get the advanced technology to travel that extra distance.
Exactly. One of the takeaways of needing more time, more technology, et cetera, is that it's that much harder to have a sort of home base on the African continent because you have to go so much further. But that also may even the playing field of the development of technology and a kind of return exploration to Europe. So could we imagine a world where it's not just the Portuguese coming down or Europeans coming down to the continent and subjugating? It's actually more of an exchange where the Portuguese have arrived, but the Asante are also really interested in what's not. The Portuguese don't arrive in Ghana. The Portuguese arrive in Senegambia, but let's just go with this really quickly. The Asante or the Wolof or whoever are also really interested in what's happening up north, and they also decide to travel north and establish an outpost somewhere in Lisbon or wherever. What would an actual exchange look like? And would that be productive? I don't know. I mean, that may verge too close to, some of the predations of our current world. But I'm thinking a little bit with something that Vincent Brown wrote, almost offhand in his most recent book on Taki's Revolt, about the ways that Europeans have a kind of fundamental monopoly of power, in part because they're able to establish outposts on the African continent, and African polities never do. They don't establish outposts in Europe in the same way that Europeans do. And so what would that look like flipped? And how to not make that martial, how to not make that military, how to not make that about some more expanding colonization and more about trade between equal partners. That also could be another kind of industry expansion.
It makes me think of, there's a novella by Kai Shanti Wilson called The Taste of Honey. I don't know if anyone's encountered that. Put it on your list immediately. Also, it's very hot. There are cuties in it. It's a hot queer novella. That seems to be the theme of my thoughts today. I don't know why. he sort of imagines a world in which Roman soldiers and folks from West Africa interact, and it's completely on equal footing, and folks are just kind of going back and forth. And the main issue of the novella is homophobia. It's not colonialism or anything like that. In fact, the African folk are seemingly way more powerful, and the Romans are coming in like, ooh, y'all got nice stuff over here and fine men and okay, you know, and it's not about, so it reimagines the world. There's still problems, right? There are gender issues, there are issues with, so it's not a utopia, but the issues are not the same issues that we have. So it's a reimagining of the African continent and the interactions between Europeans. And folks on the continent, to your point, Jessica, where folks are sort of interacting and exchanging, there could be a way that human beings, because even my imagining, like when you send us a note about, okay, this is like bigger planet, I'm thinking, well, folks are still going to find a way to get to each other.
Oh yeah.
Right? Because that's just kind of human nature. But if we have sort of a different philosophy behind it, like, oh, I'm going to go to Lisbon too. I'm going to go to London too. I'm not really trying to take you over. I'm just trying to learn like what's going on. Right? And then that could be a way, you know, or these other places, right? These other cultures. And because I'm an Afrofuturist, again, I just feel like they're going to go into space.
Yeah.
Like I feel like the Dogon, like the whoever, they're like, we're already building a spaceship. We see the satellite up there and we're trying to get there just with a different sort of philosophy.
Yeah.
Not the space race, right? More like, I don't know if y'all have seen the short film Afronauts, which sort of reimagines, you can watch it on YouTube, reimagines the space race. And imagines, I want to say it's Zimbabwe. I could be incorrect about that. But what the space race would look like, you know, it's sort of based on a true story because there were folks on the continent who were thinking of traveling. They just didn't have the budget. But what that might look like otherwise if we just have a different philosophy of movement.
Yeah. And I think I really like the way you put it earlier, Susana, about like if all of these different continents and the countries on those continents just had the time that isolation buys them to like figure their own shit out and like learn about themselves and fix their internal problems, then when they do interact with each other, I feel like it's less likely to be aggressive. Like if you've already figured your stuff out and your people are happy and there are enough resources to go around for everyone, then you don't have to take over someone else to take their resources. That's what I feel.
Yeah, but I was also thinking about, you know, with having more time, there would also be more time to develop technologies to protect yourself better.
Yeah.
And I know it's like a little bit different and a little bit darker, but
let's get dark.
Definitely, you know, but I definitely think we would have that ability. And so I think being able to better protect ourselves while already figuring out all the internal issues, you know, I think our exchange would be different when we interact with other peoples, I think.
Yeah.
That's such a good point, in part because, you know, and I said it offhand, like not to get, like, if we don't get Butlerish, but you know, Octavia Butler's thing was that we are a troubled hierarchical people and that it's almost impossible to get away from that. And as a historian of slavery, you see that over and over, even like colonization and maroon colonies, like you see it over and over. So that piece about like, you know, more time to work through your stuff, more time, more space maybe to like not be predatory, to like just prevent predation, but also like more time to protect yourself. More time or more space even to create alliances. So if you have more time to make the technology to explore, I guess I'm stuck on your exploration piece, Susana, like it's so fascinating. But like, what would it look like if you have more time to create the technology and the world is so large that you can't just, not just, but like you can't go across the Atlantic necessarily in one sweep. Like, are there new islands, like new shoals in the ocean that, you know, maybe African and indigenous can come together and land in a place and like it becomes an exchange? And what then does predation, if it happens, if it's able to happen from Europe or internal, look like when you can escape and, you know, find alliance with across a broader archipelago? Like that's, you know, that also is something really interesting. And if, you know, you can pull your defenses together because you've built them, you've had time to build them.
Yeah, definitely. The idea of what like a voluntary diaspora would be like.
Yeah.
Like if you went to a place because you wanted to and your descendants like knew that, like you set it up for your descendants in the way that you wanted to, like what would that look like?
Right.
Yeah.
Those are our people across the river. We visit them from time to time. It's cool.
Yeah.
It's great.
Cousins.
Those are our cousins. Like
there would
it's
be so much
cool.
more back and forth where instead of just people from West Africa going to North America and just like being stuck there, if you made the choice to go over to North America, like then you can also make the choice to go back, and there's much more of an exchange of knowledge and resources that can lead to really good outcomes, I think.
I think part of that too makes me think of like, you know, like what you just said, Jessica, about Butler and hierarchy, and she was so worried about that. Just thinking through, like, I think other forms of society on the continent would flourish. I mean, part of, I think, the issue with the European encounter is like these patriarchal societies, these hierarchical patriarchal societies, right, that were sort of interested in warring and ruling one another. And I'm not saying matriarchy, whatever, you know, I know feminists, we get accused of that frequently, but, you know, queer focused, you know, recognizing that we had all these different kinds of ways to be before European encounters that could flourish, right? That could continue to flourish. So what would queer sensibilities look like in terms of, you know, ruling a nation or governing or, you know, understanding self and so on, so that as we're building up the capacity, right, to Nikita's point, maybe we're making these Wakandan type technologies and it's like the queer elders are leading. I don't know, you know, just like a different way of knowing, so that if there is an encounter that's violent, whether it is from space or from another continent, that we've already sort of built up a kind of leadership model that is, you know, able to combat that with sense. And it probably wouldn't look like the ideals of, you know, like African manhood and African womanhood that we sort of see in the sort of Hotep, you know.
You know, I love this idea of more of a queer, like more queer ideas being just like more common and more widespread. I know the queer community isn't perfect, but I have this sense that like it's more open to like people exploring different identities and having different ideas about what they can do with their self and their lives. And if you have that type of open-mindedness in more of like a governing philosophy,
just in every part of life,
I
think open-mindedness is necessary and important. And as you look around in societies and in every aspect of society, I think you realize that just does not exist, right? Like we get sold something and we get rid of that receipt. Like we buy it wholeheartedly, throw that receipt away. And then I think many of us are not willing to ask the questions of, well, why? You know, there's just this, many people just are happy to blindly accept, you know, accept certain things, certain mindsets without just asking, like, why? And like trying to push against. And I think like there's a lot of that that we deal with now as a people, you know, after these encounters, right? There's so many things that we were taught, so many things that need to be unlearned, but many of us are not, probably not even conscious that we need, that there's stuff to do, there's work to do, there are things to be unlearned, you know.
Have
where was it
more space potentially, or the promise or threat of more space to abscond to if if humans do what humans do, which is get rigid and in their ideas of the world. Well, all right, well, I gotta go. I'll be over here making my Black queer future, and you can go, I don't know, potentially maybe like you can go far enough that you can still have, you still cross a bridge and have interaction, but it's like, this community or this family or this household is not serving me. Let me move in a different direction, which is a little gray, not quite dark, because there's still like kinship. You know, I say all the time, I'm obsessed with kinship. There's still the kinship ties. There's still like the ways that we're human. We want to connect. We want to be social. But that promise of a space elsewhere is very tantalizing, and here actually could be a reality. Like you could create that and maybe even be on equal parts with that. Like that's really lovely to imagine.
Yeah, I love that. I want to move on just a little bit to talk more about the fact that Black people in the U.S. have really driven the production and evolution of culture, and a lot of it was inspired by having to make something out of less, like food and music with hip hop. A lot of it was because they had to make something out of almost nothing. And so I'm wondering, Susana, if you can kick us off by imagining maybe what sort of modern cultural revolutions you could see for this world.
I mean, I think I'm still thinking about the fact that they wouldn't be suffering from lack.
Yeah.
And so the ingenuity would still be there, right? But it wouldn't be because we have to make $1 out of 15 cents, right? It would be coming from a model of abundance and not a model of scarcity, right? And I'm just thinking about your work, Nikita, and thinking about geology, and it's something that I sort of engaging with in a grad seminar I taught this past spring, like rethinking like geology as a discipline. Like what would it mean if we don't have this imperialist relationship to the earth, right? That we understand like the earth is our home and we take care of it, and the earth is like a house. If you live in your house for 30 years and you never change the pipes and you don't fix the roof, it's gonna cave in on you, right? That we sort of have this relationship that we're like, we just take care of this place, and it's like, it's not the Judeo-Christian notion that, you know, human beings have been given dominion over the earth, over the fish and the, you know, the fowl of the air and all that kind of stuff, right? But rather this idea that we are sort of in sync and in community. And I think that would bring up a whole different type of music and dance and, you know, cuisine. Like I'm an omnivore, but I understand why people make a case for a plant-based diet. Like it makes sense. I get it. I love the swine, but it makes sense. It makes sense. Like that might be how they engage, right? And it's not, you know what I mean?
Oh, speaking of that, I've been listening to a lot of Splendid Table lately, like the podcast, and have been, it's really great. But one of the people that have been interviewed recently was a chef who does like vegan soul food, and his recipes sound delicious. So maybe that.
So if I can jump in, one of the things that's really interesting about this question is it also makes me think about how African-American culture has a kind of primacy. So what are the ways that like our position in the West in particular, even as a subjugated group, positions our works as kind of a cultural lingua franca that in some ways is true, but in some ways is also powered by some of the darker aspects of Western imperialism and control of industry, music industries, cultural industries, white people's fascination with Black things, you know, all of that. So it makes me like going with what Susana was saying, like if that is not the case, if we're not going off of lack and we don't require or the like motor of sort of Western cultural imperial project to like move our cultural artifacts around the world, you know, like there's so much that becomes things like jazz that comes out of like African musical traditions, drum traditions, ritual traditions, sacred and secular, the Islamic hymns, like so much comes out of that. And so if that is not happening, so that transfer across the Atlantic and Western imperialism isn't happening, like I could imagine a world in which those skills deepen even further. And now you're adding new technologies, like new instrumentation, new instruments, new devices that get created. Man, the creativity that we already know is there. Like I'm getting chills thinking about it. You know, and then and with that comes with like all kinds of new institutions, right? Like the people who were blacksmiths, you know, is there a blacksmith country? Like is there a town in which blacksmiths are like just, you know, like they're the shit and they're, you know, making all kinds of things and they're all, you know, across gender and there's all kinds of new ways of thinking about gender as in relationship to iron and the forge. And I don't know, like it like really kind of opens up a lot to imagine what would have happened if the slave trade had not interrupted the cultural institutions that were already there. And they were able to kind of like dig deep and expand. And
be able to thrive and thrive and thrive.
The stuff that we will now create in this world.
It would be absolute fire and just totally badass, right? Like just thinking about all of the stuff, all of the artifacts, like when you look at it, think about the music and all of that stuff.
The masking.
I mean, really, you know, like allowing that to evolve in an environment of that isn't, you know, one rooted in scarcity and adversity and all of that stuff. You know, like
that's the timeline I want to live on. That's the multiverse.
Yes,
right?
absolutely.
Like thinking about Wakanda, you know, and just Black excellence, just like all around.
Worldwide Wakanda. But speaking of that, like N.K. Jemisin in her Dream Blood duology kind of imagines a world sort of like this, where it's a different world. They have two moons, I believe, or maybe their sun is a red sun. Like there's a different kind of, you know, astronomically things are different, but there's no colonization. And there are some Europeans, they just call them barbarians, and they're smelly and they're just kind of in the story in the background, like, oh, I did some trading with this barbarian, but his smell, I couldn't take it.
That's what I'm talking about.
Right. So when you're done with the Inheritance trilogy, go, if you haven't read the Dream Blood duology, it's so good. And it's sort of imagining this world, reimagining Nubia, reimagining Egypt or Kemet, and, you know, doing this kind of work where it's like, oh, we can deepen the stuff that's already there. There are problems. The problems are patriarchy. Surprise, surprise. But you know, the problems are not imperialism. The problems are different, right? It's you know, part of like what Butler said of, you know, human beings are in this, like, she says this in the Book of Martha, that we're in this like deep adolescence and we need to grow up, you know. And if this like
she was so wise.
She was so wise. Maybe the being far apart gives us time as a species to grow up, so that when we encounter one another, whether it's on the continent, right? Because there's imperialism on the continent between Black folk, right? So let's, you know, that's happening. Before we even encounter anybody else, like, let's get right in our communities, right? And then if we encounter other people, we have time to build up our technology. So if they're doing foolishness, we can rebuke that. But if they've also done their work and gotten out of their adolescence, we can have a whole different.
We can
have
an adult. We can have adult conversations and adult interactions.
We can be grown.
I love it.
Yes.
This has been just really amazing, and I also have goosebumps. I love this. Susana, you study Afrofuturism, and you've given so many amazing recommendations throughout this that I'm definitely going to be putting a list together of different types of media that people can consume and engage with. But I'm wondering if you could talk a bit about why Afrofuturism is so important and what it can actually do and mean for people.
So for me, I think Afrofuturism is just one way of thinking through Black futures. I think there's lots of, we make it the catch-all for everything, but it doesn't have to be, right? It's one way to sort of think through the future with Black folks centered, and Black cultural experiences, and Black policy making, and Black architecture and music, just Black stuff centered, right? And it can be, I'm finding, particularly now that I'm at Georgia Tech and working with students across different disciplines, I work with folks in computer science and digital media and human computer interaction and architecture, and they're like, what would an afrofuturist architectural epistemology look like? I'm like, I don't know, let's think about it. Like, we're smashing words together and I'm getting excited, and so something that also can center like the legacy is not the right word, but Black joy, right? And that not only do we exist in the future, and we're resisting in the future too, because there's always going to be BS, but that we can imagine these futures where we're like thriving and happy, and there's like sex and laughter and love and babies and queer folk and trans people, and we're just out here doing it, right? And sort of thinking through whatever our particular thing. So if it's geology or it's history or it's literature or media or astrophysics, whatever it is, that there can be this sort of Blackness is centered, but it has to be feminist. It has to be queer focused. It has to be all these other things. So when I think about Afrofuturism, because it can be a boys club, oftentimes when we talk about Afrofuturism, we mention a bunch of dudes and many of them are great. However, we need to be talking about Black women, trans and cis. We need to be talking about non-binary people and gender non-conforming folk, queer folk. Like,
absolutely,
we are the future. So
yeah.
I was
that was all over the place, but
I was smiling as you were talking about that, right? Because in thinking about a future where Africans and like people of Africans and Black people are thriving, right? Like in this space where we are right now, with all of the bullshit and all of that, there are Black people who are in all these different spheres of life and thriving. Well, they're thriving despite the bullshit.
Yeah.
So just in thinking about getting that centered, like that is exciting. And I think definitely doable because you already have people doing it right now, right? I think it's a matter of making sure that you do it and you do it visibly so that the younger ones coming up after you, right, can see, oh, this person did it. And, you're like making the way and helping get the next generation into this space, into this mindset of, no, we don't have to buy into the bullshit that, we're less than, we're this and all that stuff. No, like we belong here, we're just as good or even better sometimes,
better.
And like, we don't have to continue to sit or stand on the sidelines, like we belong here. Just as much.
And I think the other thing too is systemic change, right? Like in this moment where, 5-6 years ago, and people have been talking about defunding the police a long time and about abolition and so on, but that is becoming a mainstream conversation. Like an Afrofuturist world is a world in which police don't exist, right? They don't exist, not as we know it. There might be you having conflict with your partner and there is someone you can call. There is a place in which you can work things out. If someone has harmed you, it's like harm is going to exist, but the systemic organization that is based on slave patrollers, like that's not that's not centering Black life. You know what I mean? So I think sometimes the thing about Afrofuturism, it can sound very Pollyanna-ish and it can be very individually sounding like, oh, I'm thriving in the future. It's like, no. It's about institutional, like the exercise that you've invited us to think about, Moiya, right? That it's like continent-wide, country-wide, statewide, community-wide, village-wide. Like it's not just about individuals, it's about these larger systems and how we relate to one another and the world, right? That there can be another way and that we can take practical steps to make those things happen.
Yeah, I love that. And let's like continue on that road because we're almost at the end of time and I want to end on a hopeful note and a practical note too. I'm wondering if any of you, because clearly this is not like the world that we've just discussed is not the reality that we have here, but there are groups who are working to get Earth closer to that ideal. And I'm wondering if any of you have any favorite organizations who are doing the work to create a world where Black people are free.
just a quick
I can
question?
start. Yeah, it's
Go
no,
for
it's,
it.
it's
Go
a
for
question.
it. Go for
Yeah.
it. Go for it.
So police brutality and defunding and abolishing the police has been a huge focus lately. And so that's where my example is going to come from. Campaign Zero has this movement called 8 Can't Wait, and it's like scientifically proven ways, or like ways that you can change the police force and the way that policing is done, that have been shown to significantly reduce the amount of violence against Black and brown people. These 8 different policies of like training police to reach for firearms last, and increasing the amount of conflict resolution and management training that police go through, things like that. So I've been paying a lot of attention to Campaign Zero and 8cantwait.org. What about the rest of you? Or maybe if you haven't been paying attention to it because it's too painful and you have other shit going on, that's valid too.
I wish that was the case. I'm so glued to the internet, like I can't look away. I've heard of 8 Can't Wait. I've actually been a bigger fan of 8 to Abolition, which was a group of folks who came together sort of in response, I think, to 8 Can't Wait. I'm not sure what the longer backstory there is. So, but one of the things they do is they lay out like 8 parameters of like abolishing the police, which has been a Black feminist and women of color, queer folks prerogative for like 2 decades, I guess now, or longer. I feel like it's historical, but sort of the organizing I think of is around critical resistance and insight women of color against violence, which is how I entered into it, and that's about 2 decades now. And so I've been following that and using, they have a really great graphic and various outline of resources and principles, because I find that I'm, because of the moment, increasingly in conversations about like, what do you mean defund the police? How is that even possible? And, those two questions, I retweeted somebody saying that online. It's like the two questions are like expressing impossibility of that ever happening, and also complete ignorance about what that means at the same time.
Also just the complete and total lack of imagination. Like, can you really not imagine a world where police don't exist in its current form? Like, what?
Are the police so great to you? Like, really? Even to white people, are they really that wonderful? So I found that really useful, both as talking points, but as also like guiding points, those 8 points, like they're concrete realities of what is required to abolish the police as a thing that actually very much can happen and should have happened already. Also, very into critical resistance and the resources they have and the work that they've been doing. The other two, and then I'll stop, is Transform Harm, which is, I think, less of an organization and more sort of a collection of resources around transformative justice, and exactly like what Susana was saying, like we can imagine a future in which we shouldn't imagine a Pollyanna-ish future. We should imagine a future in which harm probably still happens, but we have better tools to manage it that don't call on the police, but still get redress, whatever that might mean. So there's a transformharm.org. It's like amazing resources there. And then of people I think who are like actively trying to create a better world, like the person who comes to mind is Alexis Pauline Gumbs and the Mobile Homecoming Project and Black Feminism Lives, and the work that she and Sangodari Wallace are doing to like literally evangelize Black feminist love and principles into the world and like infuse a whole different way of thinking about everything. It's really kind of trying to do like exactly what we're doing, open up our imagination a little bit more, because I find, like you're saying, people suffer, and it's a product of, colonialism and early modern era, from a lack of imagination. And for some people that's a comfort, but it's untenable at this point. So how do we train our imaginations to be broader? So I often think of Alexis Pauline Gumbs' work in doing that, but there are many others, I'm sure. And
Right. Great. Anyone else?
Yeah, I would say a couple. So Black Quantum Futurism, they're a collective out of Philadelphia. So Rashida Phillips and More Mother. More Mother is also an artist, and you can listen to their work on like Spotify, anywhere. But Rashida Phillips is a lawyer. I want to say she's a public defender, and they're sort of combating gentrification through Afrofuturism. And they've written all these books. I think Black Quantum Futurism, Space-Time Collapse, Part 2 is coming out. I just saw something on social media, so I'm like, I need to buy that.
Nice. Going on the list.
I mean, and talk about astrophysics. They're really engaging in some theoretical physics in these texts, so you will find it very interesting. So they're sort of doing this really high theory, but also this community work that they're in the trenches. They're making like toolkits for the community to sort of like when folks come in and they're trying to buy up property and do different things. So, you know, very pragmatic and very esoteric at the same time, which is really my shit. Like I'm here for that iteration. Right, expand like Alexis's work, right? Expanding our minds and getting us to think way outside the box, but still like in the community doing this work. Like they don't have to be theory and praxis don't have to be at odds with each other. And I think Black folk, Black feminists, Black queer folk, Black trans folk, we clearly we on that. We already know that, but sometimes people try to come at us like we can only do one or the other. So I would say Black Quantum Futurism and a local to me organization, SNAPCO, Solutions Not Punishment. They're based out of East Point, Georgia. Their executive director is Tony Michelle Williams. And they really center on sort of Black trans folk, sex workers. They've been really pivotal in the protests here in Atlanta. They've been thinking about Black trans sex workers and decriminalizing their work, right, and supporting them and standing by them. So that they're a local organization that deserves a lot of love. So definitely check them out. Yeah, those are two that come top to mind right now.
Great, thank you.
So I've definitely been ignoring a lot of all of this because honestly, it's really depressing that in 2020, we are dealing with these things. And so like in thinking of, you know, being here and like thriving and doing the work to help get the others, you know, to see that we belong here in this future and there can be a future where we are thriving. The stuff that I have been paying attention to by way of Twitter is some of the work that is being done to try and get the geosciences, which is traditionally a field dominated by people who don't look like us, that are older and wearing lots of, you know. So there's been a push to try and get to make the geosciences less racist and to improve, you know, make it more inclusive. And so there's been some work that has been sort of spearheaded by Dr. Hendrata Ali. And so like I've been seeing, like that's the stuff I've been paying attention to and, you know, like retweeting and helping as much as I can. But there are also like, you know, I try to think about what can I do to help in this future, and what I can do is, you know, stand up and be a Black geoscientist. Just, you know, be myself. And so like there are organizations that I'm a part of, like the National Association of Black Geoscientists. And I remember like the first time I went to an NABG meeting was in 2018. And, you know, it was there that I was introduced to this really large community of awesome Black geoscientists. And like when you think about community, it's like, you know, in every sense of the word, you know, it's like you get in there and there are these older ladies, like these aunties who, you know, after meeting you for 5 minutes, embrace you. And it's like, you know, you are awesome. You are the future. You've got this. You're going to be great. And then there's this whole community that exists that's willing to mentor you, you know, and willing to help, you know, help you find opportunities and all that stuff. And so I really applaud the work that they're doing. Like I met her at NABG in 2018 and started following her since then. And, you know, just the work that she's doing and, you know, pushing and calling on societies to, you know, stand up with, you know, their Black members and saying, hey, like, this is not okay. Like, we need to, you know, make this more inclusive. And then also just like reading the Black in the Ivory. Like, you know, like just reading that and just cringing and just shaking my head. And it's just like all these. Like,
but at the same time, like not being surprised, right?
Oh, yeah,
because we've had
definitely
those
not.
experiences.
Definitely not. But it's just wrong and it's just terrible that so many of us have been having those experiences. So like I'm honestly, it's great to watch people stand up, you know, and speak their truth and fight against this system that has allowed that to happen. for such a long time. And it's my hope that we will be able to move past this, at least in the science. Like, right, we're all smart people here. Like, what do you mean this is okay? Mm-hmm. How is this okay? That makes no sense to me, you know?
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for sharing that, and for being here with me, all of you. We're near the end of time, so I'd like to give you all the chance to like promote anything you're doing, and I'll go backwards from before. So, Susana, if people want to find out more about you and what you're doing, how can they do that?
They can follow me on Twitter. My handle is I am Crunkadelic. I also tweet under the Crunk Feminist handle a lot. So if you're seeing tweets from the Crunk Feminist, it's me by and large. Live tweeting Insecure or whatever,
Dude.
Yes, I need to catch up on last Sunday. So no spoilers. No spoilers. I still haven't caught up. Or you can find me on Georgia Tech's website. So.
Great.
Cool.
Great. Thank you. Jessica, what about you?
I'm on Twitter, JMJAFRX, JMJAFRIX. I have a new book that is coming out. So that is on Amazon. It's also on IndieBound, as somebody told me today, which is kind of cool.
Nice.
And you can buy it from the Pen Press website, actually at 40% off if you go through the virtual Burps book sale. So that link is on my Twitter right now.
I'll share that link in the description so you can get this book because it sounds awesome.
And I'm also doing a lot of various Black digital things, absconding Marinage digital things with a team of amazing grad students and colleagues at Hopkins and Michigan State University. So check out electricmarinage.com or electricmarinage.xyz. We do Marinage with 2 R's, the Spanish way. And follow some of our stuff there. So.
Yeah. Great.
Nice.
I'll link to all of these below, don't worry.
Cool. I'm on Twitter at NLECONGEO, but I've honestly just been spending lots of time introspecting and like trying to, that's honestly like coming back home and trying to reconnect to the land and to the folks here and all that good stuff. But I tweet from time to time, and so that would be the place to find me.
Cool. All right. Thank you so much. I feel like my soul is cleaner after this conversation. Thank you for doing that with me. Any last thoughts before we end?
Thank you. This was such a great exercise. Thank you for doing it.
It was. Thank you so much for inviting me. And it was great to be here with all of you guys. It was,
awesome. I hope that you continue to use this world as an escape. If you're in pain right now, I hope that if you are a white person or a non-Black person, that you think about this world and think about how different our world could have been if this one little change, if just the size was different, and if we hadn't had such a horrible history of slavery and colonization. So definitely think about that. If you create any art about this world, share it with the hashtag Exolore. I would love to see it. Stories, drawings, songs. I would absolutely love to get those. But yeah, I thank you all for joining this with me, and I'm going to stop recording now.
Wait, can I add something real quick?
Oh, yeah, definitely.
Like, and thinking about, the last thing you said and the message to people who are non-Black and all that. So it is the case that this fictional world that we just created doesn't exist, but we can think about the things that we spoke about here, and think about what can we do as individuals to try and help get our current world a little bit further forward into, like a step into that direction. And so that is kind of like my charge to people, is to just think about how you in your own small space can help to make this world a better place.
Yeah, do that. Please do that. Thank you for that charge. All right.
Welcome.
Actually gonna stop recording now.